Pluto, which means that which is hidden, is a dwarf planet at the very edge of our solar system that was only discovered by modern astronomers in 1930. The planet's small size and strange elliptical orbit causes it to be invisible, even to telescopes, for most of its long trips around the Sun, which take 248 years per revolution. Pluto is named after the Roman god of the Underworld, and the Romans absorbed this mythology from the Greeks, where Pluto's equivalent is Hades. And I think that this is useful to remember because we more directly associate the word Hades with the Underworld, and this is the most important signification of the planet Pluto. Pluto is the ruler of the Underworld, also rules organized crime, the mafia, and let's be honest, modern nation-states aren't that different from the biggest cartels and criminal organizations. So Pluto rules all shadow governments, the deep state, and the military, pharmaceutical, industrial complex, and so on. The most well-known and important myth about Hades tells how he fell in love with the beautiful Persephone as she was out picking flowers in the wild. Due to Hades' intense nature, he became obsessed with Persephone to the point that he decided to kidnap her and take her to the Underworld, where he made her his queen. Persephone's mother was Demeter, goddess of agriculture and one of the many lunar goddesses, and the abduction of her young daughter caused her to grieve so much that she paled and became thin, wasting away, causing life to suffer on Earth. There are different versions to the next part of the story, but the one that works best magically is the version where Hecate discovers the abducted Persephone in the Underworld and leads her back to the land of the living. Hecate is represented by the new moon, the phase of the moon which is invisible, i.e. in the Underworld, and Demeter in this myth represents the moon's visible phases. But Hades did not want to let his young bride go, so he went to Zeus to plead the case that if Persephone had eaten anything during her time in the Underworld, it would make her part of the land of the dead, as was his law. But Hades knew that after his many attempts, he had finally convinced Persephone to consume some food, specifically 6 pomegranate seeds. So a deal was struck that Persephone would live 6 months of the year above the earth with Demeter, and 6 months below the earth in the Underworld with Hades as his bride and queen. So it is Hades, or Pluto, who causes the lunar cycle to begin in the first place, with Persephone's original abduction, and also the cycle of the seasons because of Zeus's decree. Hades, or Pluto's power, is undeniable. He was able to convince Zeus, ruler of the Olympians, to give him Persephone half the time, causing the earth to suffer from her absence. He uses subterfuge and manipulation to get what he wants, originally abducting Persephone and causing her to be perhaps the earliest case of Stockholm Syndrome, turning her into his queen and convincing her to consume the pomegranate seeds, effectively trapping Persephone in the Underworld for part of the year. In fact, it seems like there was some degree of collusion between Zeus, who rules over creation and the other Olympians, and Hades, who is his brother. In some versions of the story, Zeus conspired with Hades to allow the rape of Persephone in the first place because there was no doubt her mother Demeter would object to Hades as a suitor. Zeus also enforced the rule of Hades that none could be allowed to leave if they'd consumed the food of the dead, despite the obvious manipulation. All of this speaks to the powerful but hidden influence that Hades, or Pluto, wields. And since it was Hades' desire that set off the eternal cycle of the waxing and the waning of the moon, we can further attribute the transformative powers of rebirth and resurrection to the ruler of the Underworld. Using this mythological context as our guide, and a number of excellent astrologers as a reference, I'd like to look at this mixture of Pluto's significations: power, corruption, subterfuge, obsession, manipulation, domination, and so on, and examine how they will affect the next several decades as Pluto is finally beginning its long ingress from Capricorn into Aquarius. And I want to encourage us to look at this fairly dark period of time with some bravery and faith in the universe. We'll review Pluto's influence in the recent past, a glimpse at what these transformative energies will mean for our future, and why the corrupting nature of Pluto actually serves to expose and purge the evils of the world in preparation for a brighter, more egalitarian future. Welcome to the 8th episode of the Postmugglism podcast. My name is Nate, aka Postmugglism, and this is my show. Thanks for tuning in. In this episode, I'm going to offer some takes on Pluto's move from Capricorn to Aquarius, talk about why it's a big deal, and how I expect this transit to reshape the world, for good and ill, and how that affects those of us who are trying to live outside the dystopian systems of control which have such big Pluto energy. This is a big transit. It lasts a long time, and the world will be unrecognizable by the time it's over. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Pluto and Aquarius. Fair warning, this episode touches on some touchy topics and controversial subjects, but I have provided the receipts for pretty much everything I'm saying in this episode, and if there is conjecture, I'll be sure to point it out. Links to all my source material can be found at the bottom of the show description, wherever you're watching or listening. But before I get started, let me tell you just a little bit about myself and how to get plugged into all my other content about magic, astrology, spirituality, homesteading, our own sanctuary building project in the jungle, and more. First of all, this podcast is available everywhere people listen to podcasts, so Apple, Spotify, Google, etc., and can be watched instead on my YouTube channel. Just search for Postmugglism. Please do click the subscribe button wherever you're tuning into today so that you won't miss any future episodes of this show. To tap into the rest of my free magical content, I highly recommend that you subscribe to my email newsletter. Just go to my website, www.postmugglism.com, and you can sign up for the newsletter right there in the sidebar. I share content on several platforms, but if you subscribe to the email newsletter, you'll get notified by email whenever I post important new content on any platform. And that would include stuff like this weekly podcast, my monthly Lunar Mansion election guides, articles, and other one-off videos on practical magic, updates on our project, and so on. Again, you can find all of that at www.postmugglism.com. Okay, now on to the topic at hand, the ingress of shadowy, problematic, transformative Pluto into the air sign of intellectual, cerebral, science-minded, calculative, and revolutionary Aquarius, and what this means for us as we try to flourish in these challenging times. Let's start with some of the most relevant astrological significations for Pluto. Pluto rules power, transformation, rebirth and resurrection, hidden things and revealing them, obsession, domination, control, corruption and revealing it, the shadow self, wealth from the earth, so gold and silver and so on, surveillance, technocracy, manipulation, and let's not forget crime and criminality, all the fun stuff. In contrast, Aquarius sounds great on the surface, but its pairing with Pluto is reason for concern. The sign is cerebral, high-minded, distant, aloof, diffuse. It prioritizes progressivism, equality, and technology. The digital world, astrologically, is ruled by air signs, for example, and this is the catch. Pluto's discovery in the 20th century, in 1930, infuses this period of time and all the transformative things that came out of it with Plutonic energy. To see this in effect, we need only examine the many revolutionary technologies which exploded onto the scene in the 20th century, like atomic energy, for example. But the most relevant of the 20th century associations are undoubtedly digital video surveillance and what we disingenuously refer to as AI. And while AI was not born in the 20th century, it was certainly conceived of during that time, and I would argue that it has still not yet been created. So what I mean when I say AI is fake AI. Like so many public spectacles, with AI, there are always men behind the curtain, pulling levers and whatnot to dazzle and distract the observers. And this is the Plutonic energy I'm referring to. We don't have AI. We only have reductive machine learning algorithms trained with biased data, the man behind the curtain. But revealing the ugly, hidden side of things is the karmic function of Pluto, and for better or worse, the man behind the curtain will always ultimately be revealed, as will all the corrupt, manipulative, and domineering forces hiding in the domain of Aquarius. Crime, corruption, and socio-psychological manipulation through technology and technocracy will swell to previously unimagined levels. But then much of it will be revealed as well, and this is how we'll learn to work with these technologies responsibly, by first being irresponsible with them and then dealing with what comes of our recklessness. Still, what's coming next will be undeniably ugly and uncomfortable, dark, and a bit dangerous, particularly if you enjoy freedom and speaking your mind. In Aquarius, Pluto's hidden hand grasps information tightly in one fist and holds our access to society in the palm of his other hand. His shadowy energies will manifest in the revealing of the corruption of our entire way of life, which, honestly, probably already exists and we just don't know about it yet. And wherever you are and whatever you're doing, he'll be looming over your shoulder as the eyes of Big Brother fill the world. Psychological manipulation and mind control are also ruled by Pluto, as is terrorism, particularly the send a message kind, and in general, the amoral willingness to do anything so long as you get your way. And to make a fine point, Pluto also rules vast wealth, powerful people, conspiracy, and deception. So, while the last few years we saw these things make themselves known and their powers felt in the physical world, next we can expect these shadowy powers to take over the digital world. The problem is that so much of our lives are digital now that losing our access is a legitimately scary prospect, but the cost of participation in modern society is quickly becoming too high to bear. I won't sugarcoat this for you. This transit lasts about 24 years, so it's not like we're going to see the error of our ways quickly and change course in the next couple of years. Things have to get much worse before they're going to get better. It's just the way of things. But it's also important to remember that Pluto spent the last 15 years in Capricorn, moving in during the financial crisis in 2008, and out again now during a financial crisis, a supply chain crisis, and other things. In Aquarius, it simply moves into the digital realm, the realm of science, knowledge, and social structures. This will cause world-changing transformation in those areas and others over the next 20 plus years. Afterwards, Pluto will move on to transform the watery realm of Pisces, reshaping human understanding of the imaginal and spirituality. Then, war and violence in Aries. But before any of that, Pluto actually spends 2 years going back and forth over the last few degrees of Capricorn and the first few degrees of Aquarius as it retrogrades near the cusp. So we get a little Pluto in Aquarius, and then a little Pluto in Capricorn, and then another little taste of Aquarius and another dose of Capricorn before Pluto finally settles into Aquarius for a long time. The thing is that Pluto is always somewhere, so it does no good to try to hide from the darkness that he represents. The point of his presence in an area of a chart, yours, mine, or perhaps the United States, for example, is to bring the darkness to light so that we can exorcise the evil that's revealed. So while his presence is deeply discomforting, it's also deeply necessary if we're to grow and evolve, particularly as a society. While we're collectively banishing our demons, individually we just have to try and avoid as much of the drama as possible over the next couple of decades until the transformative effects of Pluto in Aquarius, as well as Saturn in Pisces and other fateful astrological influences, have run their course and life settles down again. Exactly how long that will be is anyone's guess. So in the meantime, we need to find a way to thrive in the decline, amidst the corruption, but without being corrupted by it, in the fringes of a toxic society and under the cloak of obscurity. Because the worst of Pluto is his associations with the underworld, meaning corruption, crime, and conspiracy at unthinkable levels. The good news is we'll probably discover who's behind some of the greatest plots of our age. The bad news is that we'll have to live through a gauntlet of psyops, organized crime, state-sponsored terrorism, and biotyranny that we largely can't avoid and must simply endure. The pillars of modern life, like technology, science, democracy, and so on, have all been corrupted and weaponized to the point that they can't be trusted. They're a deception, one that's going to be revealed in the course of this transit. Discovering the rot in our civilization will force us to compost it and grow ourselves a newer, better one, a more egalitarian one in accordance with the qualities of Aquarius. For those of us looking for high ground to weather the coming storm of techno-dystopia, the partially visible activities of Pluto's Black Hand are all important data points to consider in our resilience plans. The framework to keep in mind as we go through all the darkness ahead isn't fear, though, because fear is the mind killer, and it isn't even preparedness, because some of these things can't be fully anticipated or avoided. It's about contextualizing them so that we understand the necessity of what's coming from a cosmic perspective. When new things are introduced into the world, like new technologies or social structures, for example, what immediately follows is like a land grab or a gold rush, and like both of those examples, it creates a Wild West scenario. Before personal restraint, social mores, or laws can develop, there is a full-tilt anarchist period in which the predatory tend to prey on the vulnerable. This is as true in new growth forests as it is in new economies. Opportunism rules, briefly, but limitless opportunism is unsustainable and collapses under its own weight in corruption, which brings us to where we are currently in the timeline. Pluto's ingress into Aquarius reveals the corruption rotting technology, science, politics, and the materialist rationalist worldview in general, and how our best intentions towards equality, tolerance, and fairness have been weaponized to divide, conquer, and enslave humanity. All of this will be revealed over the course of this 24-year transit, and this is the framework to think with as we go through what I see are the major concerns, the issues that we'll all have to deal with during Pluto's time in Aquarius. It's particularly relevant that beginning on February 20th, 2022, Pluto returned to its original position at 27 degrees Capricorn in the Sibley birth chart for the United States, and due to retrogrades, it slowly moves back and forth over that degree until 2024. The Pluto returns of other nations have historically coincided with turmoil, disaster, economic collapse, and restructuring. Back on February 20th, 2022, Biden was a couple days away from making the announcement that the U.S. was convinced the Russians were going to invade Ukraine and calling for the National Security Council to discuss the Ukraine crisis, which of course quickly led to appropriating over $115 billion in U.S. taxpayer dollars for military, economic, and humanitarian aid. As the conflict in Ukraine drags on, it continues to demand more and more U.S. military and economic support. This inevitably costs the American taxpayer more money when they're already struggling to make ends meet with skyrocketing energy costs, hyperinflation, and other concerns that are more close to home. There are other aspects of the Pluto return which are also very loud, but the way that the conflict in Ukraine is most likely going to be bookended by Pluto's conjunctions with its natal position in the US's chart is portentous to say the least, particularly because it's occurring in the second house of wealth, and the impact of this conflict and its related sanctions have already been devastating on the US economy. Because Pluto is in the US's second house, it's important to recognize that the rebirth signified by Pluto will be primarily financial and will, of course, involve a heavy criminal element. And since the petrodollar has been, for many years, the reserve currency of most of the world, the ramifications will reach far and wide. The shift away from the SWIFT banking system to a multipolar global financial system because of the introduction of BRICS, named after its founding nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is a slow process, but it signals the eventual end of the petrodollar. Behind the scenes, or perhaps I should say from the underworld, fears of an impending bond default are driving the intended relaunch of the US dollar as a digital currency, as well as all the other issues that I'll be discussing in this series. The impact of this financial event would reshape the world in itself, though. And the potential for the US to default on its debt obligations is very real, and to prevent financial collapse, it appears that the US and its Western allies are prepared to do essentially anything, even provoking wars around the world in the hopes of securing valuable assets. However, all their best attempts to prop up the dollar at the expense of the ruble, for example, have thus far failed, and the dollar is only keeping afloat by war profiteering on the energy crisis that NATO artificially created in Europe. This is not a sustainable strategy in the long term. With the US as the driving force manifesting Pluto's dark energy into the world, and the US essentially dictating Western policy, we can safely assume that if it's happening in one Western nation, then it will find its way into every Western nation eventually, and then everywhere else. What happens in the US, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, etc. will spread throughout the world by sanction or invasion. And since the United States Pluto return is at 27 degrees Capricorn, it heralds Pluto's ingress into Aquarius, and all this dark transformative energy that's been reshaping the US economy, and with it the rest of the world, is now going digital. The area of my greatest concern, and definitely the one that I'm most convinced will become a reality, is total digital surveillance by an unelected, global, technocratic meta-government. It seems likely that this will occur through the mandatory use of an app, like DIA, for example, the one currently being tested on the around 18.4 million person Ukrainian population, wherever they are in the world. An app like this already exists in China and includes social credit systems that impose controls on your behavior, movement, and so on by throttling your access to society and money via this mandatory app. USAID, the US government's racketeering, loan sharking arm, funded the DIA project, considers it a big success, and is in the process of exporting it to other nations, particularly developing nations vulnerable to corruption and manipulation via pressure from the United States and other Western nations. DIA makes it very simple to narc on your neighbors, to report Russian collaborators or people expressing dissenting opinions, which Ukraine is well known to then secretly and permanently disappear off the street. It's a fucking dystopian nightmare that will allow a corrupt state to track your every movement, spy through your device's camera and microphone, and control your access to every aspect of society, your money, emergency services, and so on. It is your physical passport, your health history, your sole point of access to your financial assets, and your legal identity, rolled into one easily manipulated system. This has big plutonic energy. It's also a lot of things wrapped up in one very attractive, and now mandatory, Trojan horse. The app facilitates every aspect of interaction with the government. You want a permit, you apply on the app. You get your approval or your denial on the app. And most of this is likely to be handled by algorithms and smart contracts. Australia announced this month that they are merging their individual states' digital ID programs into a unified national digital ID program, upon which the government's app called MyGov operates. MyGov facilitates, or I suppose restricts access to, ID-based services like driving licenses, Medicare cards, senior citizen cards, and work licenses, and enabling citizens to use MyGov to renew passports and enroll to vote, along with other services, is coming soon, according to articles from globalgovernmentforum.com. And the US is not far behind with the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2022, which is currently listed as having been introduced at congress.gov. Typically, the US population is the last to be made aware of programs like this until all the kinks have been worked out elsewhere and the powers that be can ensure a seamless rollout to decrease resistance. While all that's happening, the United States media and Congress are both doing their best to ignore the bombshell revelations that the state and big tech have formed deep but carefully obscured back-channel ties. They take the form of disinformation lobbying groups, private signal groups, and shared internal Slack channels between the U.S.'s most notorious three-letter agencies, lobbying think tanks, and the biggest and most ubiquitous tech companies, social media companies, and so on. Their stated purpose is suppressing dissenting voices and censoring anything they broadly characterize as misinformation, and many millions of taxpayer dollars have been used for this purpose. Right now in Canada, Bill C-10 is before the Parliament, which seeks to reclassify any internet publishers or platforms, so social media sites, YouTube, etc., and their content creators, as broadcasters, subjecting them to the same governmental oversight as their television stations and so on. And I think it's essential to recognize that the encroachment on liberty, freedom of speech, choice, movement, belief, etc. that these technocratic endeavors represent transcends the controlled opposition matrix of political parties. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle your political representative pretends to sit on. They all consistently vote in support of these types of measures. And the entire political system being co-opted by special interests to put on performative democracy while the wealth of humanity is laundered by oligarchs and the population is subjected to biological and ideological tyranny is just very plutonic as well. When the underworld comes to the surface, you see it everywhere, including the institutions that you assumed were fundamentally opposed to your harm, like the government. To the contrary, the underworld rules the state. The state is an extension of organized crime, not an enemy of it. Moving on to what we can do about all of this, I'll talk about broader, more general strategies for escaping the coming darkness more in the last episode of the series, but I don't want to spend all this time talking about the bad in a big clump here without illuminating the topic with a little hope as well. There are strategies for sheltering yourself and your family from the machinations of Pluto and his minions on Earth, though we should not delude ourselves that we can avoid or escape the situation entirely. Our attitude should be that every bit we can avoid or delay is a victory because we're not trying to win against the tide of corruption and evil that's sweeping through the world today. We're trying to survive it and to carry a torch for freedom, liberty, autonomy, and through those, our own personal views and beliefs. The best strategies against pervasive surveillance and censorship are obscurity and obfuscation, hiding in plain sight, and being as confusing and unpredictable as possible. More specifically, I don't think there's much hope in avoiding surveillance completely. Smart cameras are being installed in too many places. Or censorship for that matter, because Google is already resculpting search results, books are disappearing from Kindle and other providers, and so on. There's no stopping this trend. But how much we participate in society determines our level of exposure, and how much of our lives we expose to the greater world around us can largely determine how much active oppression we actually endure. It's counterintuitive because we've historically valued activist practices like protesting and so on as a way to stem the tide of tyranny. Unfortunately, our transformation has changed the rules drastically, and we've simply not kept up. Between what happened at the BLM protests, the Freedom Convoy in Canada, and whenever New Zealanders have protested for Indigenous rights over the last few years, it should be obvious that A, protesting accomplishes nothing, no meaningful social change is achieved. B, the state, wherever you live, now absolutely has the technology and the motivation to tag, track, and monitor you long after you recognize your right of assembly. And C, the powers that be will not shy away from imprisoning you, spying on you and your network of contacts using your own phone, and preventing you from being able to earn a living or confiscating your livelihood outright. In this environment, they have effectively squashed our ability to dissent. It's not really about rights anymore, it's about capability. And the very notion of dissenting voices is predicated on the idea that anyone is listening in the first place. Attempting to sway politics through rational means, lobbying, grassroots organizing, canvassing, or whatever you like, is an exercise in absolute futility now. Information and access are too tightly controlled now to hope to be able to hold the untouchable elite accountable. Instead, our most viable strategy is radical non-participation. Opting out of the system, or at least keeping it at a safe distance, is how we separate ourselves from it. Avoiding spending too much time in places that are actively surveilled with facial recognition cameras, even moving away if the place where you live is going in that direction, is a difficult but very real choice that you may face. The truth is that no system works completely, and you can always be an exception to the rule, but our intended overlords will take their victories wherever they can. Where there is concerted resistance, there may be long-term holdouts who avoid the worst of the technocracy. Rural areas with dispersed populations are more challenging to trap in their net, and the community is less likely to go along with government intrusion. Or, like my family, you can move out of Western nations entirely to a developing nation where the local government is simply incapable, logistically, of implementing the full technocratic vision of digital governance. Keeping a low profile, moving out of easily surveilled urban environments, and surrounding yourself with like-minded people as much as possible will help you avoid the worst of technocracy and its culture of total surveillance and dissent-free compliance. What's often most difficult to understand about the world we live in is how much we don't know about it. Most people suffer from the delusion that the media, the government, and anything else that we call an institution was created by and for the people, and is designed to protect the people and ensure their freedom and flourishing. Pluto is here to reveal all of this nonsense for the lazy, naive idealism that it is. What is most useful to the governing bodies of representative democracies, whether they are genuinely democratic or not, is the mandate of the constituency to be governed. If that mandate crumbles, there are simply not enough elites to stop the masses from overthrowing society, which is why countries like the US perform elaborate rituals of election to create the illusion of participation by the people in government. To maintain the mandate to govern while also stealing the wealth and freedoms of the population is, no doubt, a challenging undertaking, but it becomes drastically more feasible when that nation is distracted, self-absorbed, infantile, naive, and programmed for compliance. And this is why the US government has been researching and experimenting on the US population, as well as others, with mind control and psychological manipulation techniques for decades, the products of which, it seems to me, are used on us now en masse. According to official history, the CIA's notorious MKUltra mind control project, where subjects were dosed with LSD and forced to endure psychological torture in hopes of creating compliance, was abandoned because it failed to produce useful results. However, the program ran from 1953 to 1973, and it's kind of inconceivable that nothing was achieved in 20 years of effort. Also, strange coincidences surrounding the project's connections to figures like mobster Whitey Bulger and Charles Manson, among others, certainly raise eyebrows. What can be assumed with certainty is that though the project was discontinued, much would have to have been learned over the course of 20 years of dedicated, if highly unethical, research that would most likely then be applied to other, as of yet unknown, projects within the CIA's long list of Black Book endeavors. Another relevant example is Operation Mockingbird, where during the Cold War the CIA infiltrated domestic news organizations in an attempt to influence public opinion globally. It's pretty safe to say that the CIA hasn't become any less nefarious since the Cold War. And again, they learned all about how to infiltrate the media at the time, and likely never actually separated from them, regardless of the Church Committee's report exposing elements of this unconstitutional conspiracy in 1976. These examples are both ancient old news, but that's exactly what's relevant about them. The CIA is not just capable or motivated. They are certainly both of those things. But one also has to imagine that they are also further along now, much better at what they do. There are also many more national intelligence agencies these days. To put a point on it, what I'm saying here is that we should assume that whatever we think the national security apparatus is capable of, they are capable of much more. We should keep in mind that human beings are generally very good at producing results when they have clear goals, massive budgets, and no moral restraint. Circling back to the motivations of the intelligence, military, industrial complex that drive these kind of projects and the huge investments that go with them, a pattern quickly emerges when you put these projects side by side. While you can't exactly hero dose an entire population with acid and turn them into drones, you would likely learn a lot about how to terrify people into compliance by experimenting on them with LSD. It seems obvious that the nonstop barrage of sensationalized fear-mongering in the media and on social media is designed to create a low-level anxiety version of the same principle, just more gradually over a much longer period of time. It's pretty well recognized that watching the news regularly affects you psychologically, and sometimes your behavior as well. When people are always afraid, or at least anxious, it's much easier to make them feel overwhelmed, and then to prey on their ignorance and panic to manipulate them into compliance. Something very much in line with CIA practices, as history demonstrates. Anxiety and mental health are linked issues, so in my opinion, we can effectively consider our mental health to be under assault by the intelligence community. And this community is no longer just the CIA, or just the national security apparatus, but the Nine Eyes nations all together which share intelligence and the many connected public and private organizations which form the global intelligence community. With mental health and self-reliance in decline in Western nations, and the populace for the most part willingly compliant, manufacturing consent is as simple as providing a convenient narrative. The sad thing is that apparently the narrative doesn't even have to be compelling, but people do have to be given some kind of explanation, even if it's a bad one, to remain compliant. For decades, we managed to believe convenient truths about the habits of Western nations overseas, upon the marginalized, and most especially, about our own annual displays of performative democracy. So obviously, all of this has been in play long before Pluto reached the cusp of Aquarius in 2023. But these examples, A, demonstrate historical precedent, B, show how active the hidden hand of Pluto actually is in our society, and C, well, you can basically just imagine all of the same types of authoritarian measures as before, but now in a post-digital transformation world, featuring AI, smart contracts, and humanless governance. But these measures will ultimately fail, because they're dumb, and the people advocating them are plainly doing so for their own benefit, not ours. Convenient truths collapse as they encounter the damned facts, those pesky, undeniable cracks in the narrative that are becoming more and more apparent as Pluto reveals the corruption at the core of the governments of the world, the crimes of their leaders, and the structures of authoritarianism. Though they were created before Pluto moved into Aquarius, they are now coming to light and simultaneously going online. Matt Taibbi's work in the Twitter files has helped to reveal the inner workings of what I'll call the meta-government, where employees of the state, spooks, and disinformation lobbyists work hand in hand with big tech companies to spotlight certain content and suppress other content based on its political leanings and so on. Because of his efforts, we can no longer deny the conjoined realities that alternative views and dissenting voices are being censored and suppressed, and that everyone is constantly being fed misinformation to shape their perceptions and manufacture consent. Of course, as soon as the national security apparatus established a direct pipeline into big tech for the purpose of controlling public opinion by controlling what information was available, they started sending huge lists of people to analyze, suppress, and ban, many of whom were only suspected of potentially having dissenting views. Many disinformation lobbying groups came into being around this time, which are basically think tanks that aren't subject to direct oversight and can play fast and loose. They supplied lists and flimsy evidence, mostly based on sifting through social media activities for affinity groups. I used similar tactics in my marketing career to target advertising campaigns, and the accuracy of these methods was hit or miss, to say the least. Also revealed in the Twitter files, Taibbi tells the story of a prominent disinformation think tank called Hamilton 68, which heavily promoted the story of Russian interference in the 2016 election, among other narratives, based on evidence they gathered using a social media intelligence dashboard. The problem is that it's fairly easy to introduce impressive, compelling dashboard intelligence for essentially any point you wish to make. And again, I'm speaking as someone who's worked in this field specifically. So it becomes very easy to surveil people based on the content they consume, who they follow, and combinations thereof. My last job was at a company who was building tools to do exactly this. And with the pipeline into big tech, it was virtually seamless for the intelligence community, politicians, and partisan think tanks to wage a cold war, an invisible war, on alternative views within the Anglosphere. While suppressing the opposition makes it easier to manufacture consent, they still need to supply a steady stream of narrative to entertain the population and provide coherence to their worldview in the form of convenient truths. And this has never been more patently obvious than in the early days of the Ukraine conflict. At the beginning of the invasion, before it was obvious that Russia was prepared to outlast, if not outright overwhelm, the NATO-backed Ukrainian military, there were a number of, to me anyway, totally unbelievable puff pieces written about the Ukrainian military, which were quickly debunked, but nevertheless saw massive viral attention in Western media outlets. The most absurd of which was the so-called Ghost of Kiev myth, where a modern-day ace of the sky purportedly shot down 6 Russian jets within hours of the launch of the Russian special operation in Ukraine. Animations of fighter jets from video games were repurposed as video footage of the mythical Ukrainian hero and circulated widely around the internet via bot farms and gullible Westerners. This was complete fiction, of course, as was openly admitted by the Ukrainian military once the truth came out. The headline from NBC News, though, says it all. Ukraine admits the Ghost of Kiev isn't real, but the myth was potent for a reason. Like, you can't even make this up. It's just too absurd. Nevertheless, again the hallmarks of Pluto are plainly visible. Corruption, manipulation, mob energy, secret deals, hidden facts, and all to exercise control over us. We can look ahead to see the many ways these darker energies will run rampant in Aquarius in digital technology, science, social structures, and so on. Our best defense against the weaponized digital world is to become more human, more flesh, more quintessentially alive, to remind ourselves the digital world is nothing but a projection, to ground ourselves regularly in the earth. Take up gardening, for example. Walk in nature, swim in the ocean, or whatever kind of bonding with nature is possible where you live. Avoid consuming too much news, and definitely avoid mainstream media, which has been controlled by the same government that regularly experiments on you and subjects you to constant low-grade psychological torture. The one that keeps you in a constant state of anxiety and pumps you full of triggering stimuli to elicit your compliance with whatever narrative benefits their global ambitions. Don't contribute. Don't give them power over you by simply avoiding their mind control. If you need to understand what's happening in the world, always look for independent sources on the ground, wherever that is. If that's in Ukraine or Russia, then so be it. Information is only valuable with context, so just because you consume something doesn't mean that you have to believe it. I try to only pay attention to the bits of information which can be corroborated by multiple sources. And I examine the underlying sources carefully with the same cautious discernment, which helps, but doesn't guarantee accuracy. I also tend to start my research from a place of disbelief in whatever the prevailing narrative is. You're safest when you believe that the only reason the government, or the establishment in general, is telling you something is because it suits their agenda. We can safely assume that they don't give a shit about keeping us informed, but they do need our compliance very badly. So just treat anything that you hear from the mainstream media, the government, and most especially the talking heads of the global intelligence community as suspect, and assume the only truth it contains is the kind that's convenient to their cause. Also, avoid becoming emotionally invested in the going-ons of half a world away, unless you're legitimately concerned about those distant problems migrating to where you live in the immediate future. Keeping an eye on the world is one thing, but avoid becoming invested so that it negatively affects your state of mind, body, or spirit. Seriously, be very careful about this. The news is literally designed to hype you up, to make you afraid, and to shape your opinion. Don't be like a reed blowing in whichever way the wind moves you. Be like a tree that stands firm in stormy weather. The more darkness you encounter and process by way of the news, and just living through these times, of course, the more negative energy collects in your body. Regularly cleanse yourself, your space, house, etc. Regularly. Cleanse yourself throughout the week, and remember to ground outdoors and cleanse your living or working space if possible, according to the waning of the moon. There's lots more to discuss over the next 2 episodes of this podcast, but this is already a lot to take in, I know, so we'll break here and come back in a week with another overdose of plutonic gloom. But just know I'm also bringing the antidote each time we talk about this stuff. We covered an awful lot of ground in this episode, so for clarity and to help it stick, I'll recap it all as succinctly as I can. Pluto is god of the underworld. He's a bit of a loner, a gloomy Gus, but a powerful and transformative force. Yet his passage through a sign signifies a necessary purgative process. He's a harbinger of death and rebirth wherever he lands in a chart. Pluto, as the ruler of the underworld, also rules crime, corruption, manipulation, secret power, the rule of the mob, and the shadow self. Pluto is not universally bad, but it is universally intense and a generally unpleasant influence. It will stay in its new home in Aquarius for 24 years, teetering on the cusp between Capricorn and Aquarius for about 2 years before fully committing to Aquarius in 2024. Relevantly, Aquarius rules science, technology, digital communication, humanitarianism, fanaticism, and social structures, among other things. This moves Pluto's darker energies into the airy Aquarian realms, corrupting and revealing the existing corruption within those areas of life so that the future can learn from our mistakes. First, we have to learn the lesson thoroughly by experimenting with a terrifying array of authoritarian wet dreams. Total surveillance, pervasive censorship, and technocratic control structures like digital IDs, social credit systems, and digital governance. Anyone that's even suspected of questioning the official narrative is secretly silenced, deplatformed, and censored to keep very powerful people in their positions of power. The intelligence community, which does the dirty work of these powerful people, has spent decades experimenting with mind control, psychological torture and manipulation, and wide-scale deception. They've been infiltrating media organizations since the Cold War, and now they've moved on to Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Google, among other places. And with all those platforms bending the knee to the state and the intelligence community, the spooks, feds, politicians, and lobbyists have all gained backdoor access to influence what information people are allowed to see, who will be recommended, and who will be suppressed. We can't avoid these problems, and we probably can't stop them from happening either. I think this course of action is fated and necessary for humanity, but it's not necessary for you to suffer because A, you can consume less news and propaganda, B, you can reduce your use of social media, and C, you can be prepared to live without these things, if necessary. And also, cleanse your energy and the energy in your space as well. Ground yourself regularly in the natural world, and try your best to avoid becoming emotionally invested in what you hear and see on the news or in your social media timeline. There's nothing to fear about a 20-plus year transit. It can't be avoided, so you might as well learn to live with it. The world's going to go to some dark places, but we don't have to go with it, and being aware of the troubled waters ahead helps us plan accordingly. I hope this episode gave you some new and useful perspective on Pluto's ingress into Aquarius and how this move is synced with the most transformative time in several generations, for better or for worse. In some cases worse, yeah, really bad. But I've tried to give you some perspective on how best to ensure your sanity, your privacy, your discernment, and your personal autonomy, and a little hope as well. Thank you for listening, or watching if you're on YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to get notified when new episodes come out each week. Next week, I'll continue to shine a light on the shadowy manifestations of Pluto and Aquarius, and share more tips on how to make yourself and your family more resilient against the coming storms. Thanks again for tuning in to episode 8 of the Postmugglism podcast. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.